Welcome to the Indian Food Explained podcast by Cook Like an Auntie. You don't have to be an auntie to make delicious Indian food. Now here's your host, Gopi Vajravelu.
Welcome to the Cook Like an Auntie podcast. Today, we have special guest, Taimoor Shahid. Taimoor and I have a mutual friend who suggested that I interview him for the podcast. She said that he cooks like an auntie and has a very interesting experience of running a pop-up restaurant in Columbia, South Carolina that was very popular. It was called the Dal House and ran for one weekend. So, Taimoor, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much, Gopi, for inviting me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So I first want to just ask you how you got into cooking.
It's an interesting question because often people ask me, and I actually did not start cooking much later, even though, of course, I was surrounded by growing up in Karachi, Pakistan, with wonderful cuisine at home, at my relatives, friends, outside. And I guess a lot of it was just internalized. But what really brought me to the kitchen was my nose. And it's a funny story because I have a very strong sense of smell. Sometimes I tell people that I have a nose of a dog almost. And it was just discovering that that led me to the kitchen. And once, for example, I was working on my dining table because that's typically the space available in the house to work. And then my mother was teaching some halwa recipe, and she was making this very difficult halwa that is made from called chana dal halwa, chane ki dal ka halwa, which is made from split chickpea lentils, the yellow ones. And you don't grind them, but you have to cook it for hours with your hand until they turn into like a seamless mesh with ghee and sugar and cardamom. But the proportions have to be just right, otherwise it will be either too powdery or too firm, and so on and so forth. So, but once it's cooked, you have to put it on a tray and then let it cool, cut it into diamond-shaped pieces, and then let it cool. And then once it's cooled down, then it's ready to eat. So my sister-in-law brought halwa and put it on the dining table to cool. And within a few seconds, I was of course smelling what was going on in the kitchen, which was right next there. And then once it came, I'm like, oh, isme ghee or chini dono come in. It's like, oh, both ghee and sugar are not enough, and that the proportion is off. And then she's like, oh, stop it, because she thought I was just teasing her. And then I just blurted it out, and it turned out to be true. So that happened a couple of times with other things that my mom cooked. And she's an amazing cook. And I think that she probably doesn't know it, my sense is she probably cooks from her nose too, and that's where I inherited it. But she's the kind of cook where even my aunts would sometimes come and for like some event that they are doing at their house for a dinner party, they're like, can you cook this for that? So once I discovered that, I became curious, and then I started making. And then once I was just alone because my parents had left the house. My kitchen is my mom's domain. When she's around, I'm not allowed there, or I wasn't at least. And now it's also an interesting dynamic whenever I'm in her kitchen or whether he's around, because because I have learned to now cook and I have my own thing. And so, but in the beginning, when she left the house, and then I had to cook for myself, is when I really started cooking. And I started with omelets, basic, simple ones. But it was only until I came to the US in grad school. And then I asked my mom for some of my favorite things that she makes, one of which is dal. That's when I started cooking through her recipes, and then changing them or learning them, because I only heard her. I've never, really learned from her in the kitchen, right? So it's my interpretation of what she tells me. And then she's not, of course, like aunties, not very precise. She's like, oh, just guesstimate these spices. I'm like, how do I guesstimate? And that's where I realized that's where the nose comes in. So that's sort of the long story of how I started cooking. mix of factors, but not until grad school I really started cooking.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that. When I was growing up, I was always interested in cooking, but my mom, I don't know if she would, she was busy, so, teaching me how to cook when I was following her around in the kitchen would have just taken up more time. But yeah, when I moved away to college, had my own apartment, I started cooking just a little bit, learned with eggs. And then as I wanted to make my mom's recipes that I missed, you'd have to call her. And I completely get with
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying that it's not precise. She doesn't know if she's using a tablespoon or a
Mm-hmm.
teaspoon. So you have to guess and learn and refine. And now, like, when she comes to visit, I give my kitchen over to her. And now I'm like paying attention, taking notes behind her about like, oh, I think, that's 2 teaspoons. That's what she used. And I totally get the same journey that you were talking about. Yeah, so I've also heard about your famous dal from our friend Ramya, who says like your
Mm-hmm.
dal is amazing, and she also said that like the last time you went over to her house, you made gajar ka halwa just like from memory without like any issues, and it turned out absolutely amazing. So I've definitely heard that your cooking is it's just at that auntie level where like you're doing things from memory and it's just coming out delicious.
Yeah, I think that that's just a sort of blessing, a gift in the sense that I don't. I mean, I am the harshest critic of my food, and there are times when I cook, and it always, of course, turns out very different. I mean, the thing with food chemistry is so complex, and especially for me when I am cooking. There are times when I'm not happy with the dal, but there are others who are loving it, and I'm like, no, it's not what. So it's kind of like I think of it as my experience of it is kind of like doing art, and it's very very joyful to me. And it brings in, I mean, one of it is like this aspect of the nose, but then the other aspect to me is always the elements coming together and the proportions and the dynamic of time and organic matter and fire and fat. So I'm also really curious about all those technical things. Like, my mom was like, oh, don't put a metal spoon in your dal because otherwise the water and the grain will split and they won't emulsify. Or I mean, she didn't say that word, but that's what happens, right? Um, and I was just like, why is that the case? So I started figuring, I mean, of course, one way is to experiment, but I was also curious about, oh, what is the scientific reason behind it and so on and so forth. So those things then got me into these food principles and food chemistry. And I mean, which makes me very slow. I mean, that's the other thing. Like I'm a very slow cook. And whenever I'm cooking with people, they're like, oh my God, it's taking forever. And I tell them that God is in slowness. You can't do things fast and then you have to, I mean, that's the thing. The same thing with fire, cooking on, like, for example, electric stove versus like fire versus like outside wood fire versus, so all of these things play a big role. So, I mean, and those are things that, of course, I've learned myself by just here and there reading a little bit, doing this research. Like one thing I knew I did not like when people put, and I think some people may consider it a blasphemy that I'm saying it, that people put tomatoes in their dal, and well, they'll put tomatoes while the dal is cooking, and I never liked it, and I only recently find out what the problem is, which is that tomatoes are acid, and acid prevents the dal from breaking down. So tomatoes and dal don't go together until, of course, once the dal is cooked, and then you want to put tomatoes. It's a different story, which also is fine. But so these are the ways in which I think I've a lot of my like taste has developed in terms of what is a good or should be a good ideal taste for something.
Yeah, I totally get that. And experimentation is like very important because you don't know. You always like just try to make something a little bit better and you don't know until you try it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I guess
So
that's the best way of learning too, because I mean, our mothers are not precise, but then that allows us to figure it out.
yeah, I'm actually reading this book called Masala Lab right now, which is about the food science of specifically Indian food. And a big part of
Mm.
like the first intro chapter is like oh, we've learned things from our mothers and grandmothers, and they like intuitively know all the things I'm about to say in this book just because it's been passed down from generation to generation. So it's really interesting to, like you say, like having our mothers like watch us cook, like they already like have experimented with all these things that we're trying to figure out. So I want to ask you about the Dal House and how this came to be because you're not a chef by training. I don't think you've ever worked in a professional kitchen before, but yet somehow you took the challenge of creating a pop-up restaurant for just one weekend. And looking at the pictures, like it looked amazing. The food looked incredible. It was completely Southern Pakistani cuisine and vegetarian. And I love that like you didn't cave to doing a butter chicken or something that population of Colombia might have expected for a South Asian restaurant. The decor was amazing. It looked like you were walking into somebody's home in Pakistan. It felt very welcoming. So I just want to talk about how this whole experience came on and how you decided to take on such a big challenge.
Yeah, this is a beautiful story, and this is a beautiful story, sort of, which is partly about my feeling at home in Colombia by trying to create this. And I was not alone in this. So this came about uh, in a community of friends. So one day, so I had just come from Pakistan, and um, one of her friends, my partner's colleague, partner, and had tasted the dal that my partner Sarah had made for some event, like the friends cooking together, and our friend and my friend Mara, she really liked it, and then she had this like dream in COVID of like making tons of khichdi and feeding people and like having a khichdi cart. And then she was like, oh my God, once Taimoor is here, we should do something. And so once I came from Pakistan, Mara and Andrew were friends. They were having a dinner party, and Mara asked me, do you want to cook? There was a concert actually. The musician from Calcutta had come, and my friend Andrew was jamming with him at a concert. And then afterwards, we had a dinner party where I just cooked dal. It was about 20, 30 people. And when just, everybody really liked it and really enjoyed it. And it was very simple. It was just a dal, and that's it, with some poppers. And maybe I made rice also, and two different kinds of dal. And then at the end of the party, a couple of Mara's friends, Nell and Julie, they were like, okay, we need to do a restaurant. We're going to do a restaurant with this food. And I had like just met these people. And in fact, it was at the moment when we were saying goodbye. And this is October sometime. And I said, sure. I mean, people always say that to me whenever they're like, oh my God, you should do a restaurant. I'm like, no, we'll do the work. And this time too, I thought, well, they're just saying it. Something will, may or may not happen. And they said, well, let's do it on December 2nd weekend. And I said, oh, that's my birthday. Why not? And that was it. And I said, well, but I'm not free before November 15th, blah, blah, blah. Long story short. But basically, come November 15th, everything was happening. And then I was like, wow, this is happening. And within 2 weeks, which included Thanksgiving break in between, we renovated this place that our friend Julie had, which was like an old building and an empty old wine bar. We sort of reappropriated it. We painted the floor ourselves and sort of renovated it a little bit, got the kitchen in order, got ourselves like food licenses, food training, and just planning. And then the decor, like, I brought a lot of stuff from that I just brought from Karachi to the place, sort of like to have a more homely, welcoming place. And it as you saw in the photo, it turned out really wonderfully. And it was in that process of making it, that like the community that we formed, like all my friendships with all of these people. And then there were other people who were part of it, like other than the core team of me. And I mean, there was actually the core team involved 10 people, all of them, without any of which none of this would have been possible. And I think that spirit was the key, because this did not start with a business plan. We had no idea where the money will come from or whether we will actually even cover the expenses. we had, and then nobody, people were just spending on small here and there, whatever they needed to buy and this and that. And I think that was also the key to it, because the fundamental motivation was to share that joy and that food with the community. And this was also in a place called 5 Points, which is near the campus, and a lot of students come here. And then the idea was to, also have them have good food. But the thing about, to come back to your point about like the menu, it was sort of very simple. But the way it was because all of these friends of mine, they gave me a free rein. They're like, do whatever you want, from like writing the menu to designing it. It wasn't like, oh, what will sell, what won't sell. I mean, of course, we were thinking about what would people like and not like. But I just wanted to cook, keep it simple. There were just two things. There were two different kinds of dals, and aloo bharta, which I described in the menu in terms which would be familiar to people here, right? I mean, an aloo bharta is just a mashed potato, but not entirely mashed. And then it's savory with, then you mix it with coriander and green chilies and red chili flakes, smoked red chili flakes, and cumin and caramelized onions. But it's a different way of making a mashed potato, and so on and so forth. So I think that really, that coming together of all those people and the community and the spirit of wanting to share the food and the joy was what you saw. And I mean, people experience it that way. People wanted to sit on like large community tables. They were like 24 people table, 18 people table, because it was wine bar or at the bar itself. And they loved that. And then a lot of people actually said that it felt like a dinner party than a restaurant. And I think that was really wonderful. And a lot of students came, and they also really loved it. And I mean, the prices was like very, you can have a meal in $8, like a dinner. And so yeah, I think that all of those things were really, that sort of came together it seemed like on its own.
From the press I've seen and the Instagram stories I've seen, I'll put links to anything that's public in the show notes here, so that the listeners can also see just how incredible this restaurant looked. The one thing I really liked about your menu is that you had like you said, two options, the aloo and the dal. I like this idea of the dal base, and then the customer could choose like the toppings, which I think you were saying your friend was thinking about, like a khichdi food cart. Like, it's an interesting idea because you see this so often now, where like someone will pick a rice base and then they can make their poke bowl on top of it with like choosing their fish and vegetables. It'd be an interesting Indian concept to have like a dal base and like a casual restaurant like that. Although the Dal House was a fancier sit down restaurant. It really did look like you were going to someone's home and just having a dinner party with your friends.
Yeah, it was very wonderful the way the decor turned out, because everybody put their heart in it. Like, there were, candles and beautiful lighting, and then wonderful music and cloth, napkins and paper, tablecloth. I mean, it was like but the dal topping, it's interesting that you pick it up. I mean, that you think of it that way. My reason for doing that was actually a more accurate description of what turns out to be basically they're two different dals. They're cooked up till a certain point in the same way, and then the recipe changes, which completely transforms the dal. One of it is like, once the dal is done with the same spices, the topping is basically the bhagar or the jhonk. And a lot of people, of course, in South Asian traditions, they put the dal into the jhonk, which is like you fry some spices together with onions, whatever. But I call it a topping because in my household, and I think generally in Pakistan that I've seen, in Karachi at least, it's people would put like the frying, and it's also much easier, I think, to put like a small amount of oil with spices on top of a pot of dal versus vice versa. So that was my way of like giving people the option of having the garlic cumin dal or the caramelized onion dal. But they're so different. Like that's why there was also like, oh, this is typically eaten with rice, but if you want, there is also paratha, and this is typically eaten with paratha. If you want, you can swap it because that's also perfectly fine. People may have different reasons to want garlic or onion dal.
It looked absolutely delicious. What challenges did you come across while either setting up the restaurant or cooking that you didn't anticipate?
I mean, setting up a restaurant in 2 weeks was kind of insane. A lot of people who are in the restaurant industry, because they're friends here, they have this wonderful place. Actually, that's core to it. So I want to mention that there's a place called FEM, which is like this sort of social club, like in a meeting space and a co-working space for women that our friend Nell began. It's in Colombia, and it's a great place with like more than 100 members. A lot of women entrepreneurs and small businesses are housed within the building, and then they have these events. And it's a meeting place for community formation and for artists and all kinds of like wonderful, quirky people doing all kinds of businesses. Their energy was core to it, and it's actually there in FEM. They were that Julie and Nell and Mara, they all know each other from being at FEM. So and Caroline also and Nell. So it's just why was I mentioning that? No, you had asked me about
The challenges you came across?
The challenges, yes. So a lot of the challenges were tackled because they, some of them have some experience with some things. But one of the things we realized was that there are delays, unexpected things. Like we ordered like floor seating cushions, and then they arrived literally a night before. And we realized that, oh, there is no cushioning in them. I thought they had cushioning, or like the order being canceled, or for example, the kitchen stove, not working, or the dishwasher being late, like the dishwashing machine, and so it could be very stressful. But in terms of, for me, cooking, the scaling was a challenge, right? And that's where the science helped, because there you can't, I mean, unless you're cooking at that level for a very long time, to scale from cooking for, I mean, I'd cooked for 100 people before for student union meetings, right? But 100 people versus, I mean, that's what so I thought it could be fine. But after the first day, we realized that we are having about 300 people a day. And then, yeah, the rhythms of, I mean, serving people food, like what they're ordering, getting that food delivered in time. I mean, and I have now way more understanding and, of course, much more respect for restaurant workers. It's an extremely difficult, stressful job. And anybody who hasn't been behind the scene, I urge them to, like, if you can't do that, but at least be mindful of people who are serving you in any capacity. It takes a lot. I was in the restaurant with a couple, most people were working like 14 hours, 15 hours a day. I was in the restaurant mostly most of us were from like 2 a.m., like until 2 a.m. from like 8 a.m. So it's, so that physical labor is itself very challenging. Like by the end of first day, I was spasming because it's so stressful. I've forgotten to drink water. And then the scaling itself of food, like how do you, and the measurements and the pots and the heat, because of course the other thing that we don't realize is that if you increase the volume, the time increases because you need much more heat. So one of the most difficult moments for me was basically once I had soaked the dal one night for the next night over, and I realized that I hadn't estimated because I was cooking dal in 2 pots. There was not one enough pot for cooking dal for 300 people. I realized that my calculations were based on the weight of the dried lentils, but now they are soaked. So I, did a small like micro experiment of comparing the weights and figuring out the percentage of water absorption. And then recalculating it through volume and putting it in pots, which may sound crazy to people, but I had to be very mathematical about it. And in the end, like the most difficult part was and I realized that the smaller pot has more dal by weight, but the volume isn't enough. So I had to put more spices in the smaller pot, which is very counterintuitive. But I trusted the math and it turned out okay.
Yeah, that's super interesting. There are just some things you don't realize until you're like in the shoes of a professional chef, like cooking at such large quantities. Like I just use a regular mixing bowl to wash my dal. I don't. You are probably like having industrial sized equipment to wash a
Yeah.
dal and rice, and yeah, there's so many little challenges like that you might
Yeah.
not even think about until the moment happens.
Yeah. I mean, for example, like, oh, I have to 50 pounds of potatoes a day, all sold out. We had bought 50 pounds. We were thinking like that will last for us 3 days. But one day they were all gone. And at 7 a.m. we were at US Food restaurant, like the food where you buy food in bulk for restaurants. And then we're like, okay, we need 50 pounds more, but like actually 100 pounds potatoes.
Yeah, well, I'm glad it worked out. I mean, it does sound like your experience of cooking for 100 people helped, but yeah, 300 is just that is a lot of people to cook for.
And then with like prop, you also saw. I mean, it's also like people are ordering things. There are options, and you have to have. It's a restaurant. It's not like a student union meeting. The dal and the rice is ready. You go and put it in a bowl and eat it. That's a very
Mhm.
different ballgame.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's also nice that you had a team with restaurant experience around you, so hopefully they were able to help you out a little bit, like even having this connection to US foods to get bulk supplies would
Yeah, I
would
mean to
probably be a
know
big
for.
challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, I wouldn't have known that, right? And then the first day we were struggling a little bit with like figuring out like the order. I mean, that the line of like order coming in and going out, that has to be very streamlined, an assembly line. And one of our friends, who Noah, who is also a professor at at some point there were three professors in the kitchen with me from the history department and religion department who were like helping in the kitchen. And Noah has worked in the restaurant as a chef for 10 years. And he came and he's like, okay, this is how it is done. And then we were fine, like, okay, we figured it out for the next 2 days and it was so much easier. So yeah, I mean, there are all these things that were integral, for our friend to show up. He wasn't part of the whole team, but for him to show up just at the right time on the first day made a huge difference. So in that sense, he became critical. Same thing. The other thing is, we realized like that the dishwasher, the person who was doing the dishwashing, and Anthony, our friend Amara's brother, he was there, and it's extremely hard job, and without because the commercial dishwasher is phenomenal. If you haven't seen one, it's like it's a 90-second cycle, but you need it because without it you can't serve so many people. You need dishes that are back. They need to be, washed and sanitized so that they can. So that is also, people like don't think that, oh, dishwasher. I mean, without a dishwasher, the restaurant cannot function at all. And those are the things that we learned and realized, and we honored them too, in the sense that like the best thing that I liked about this restaurant with my friends was that in the end, when it all was done, we were like, okay, let's check the books, and we ended up making, covering the costs and the labor for everyone, and it was kind of like, I mean, it's kind of like anarchist business model where it's open bookkeeping, everybody knows. Everybody was invited to a meeting to figure out, okay, this is what we spent, this is what we made, how should we redistribute it? And there was no sort of like, oh, this person like invested the money so they get all the change. So it was not at all like that. And everybody was paid $25 an hour almost, include, with the tips. And it's a very good wage and it's the same for everyone, the dishwasher to the host to whoever. And that kind of, I think, was really the same spirit that had gone into the restaurant, which made a big difference. And even after that, we still had some money, and that was also redistributed like different shares. Everybody had a share in it. It was not like an owner. There was no owner that way. And I think that really helped me. Like that, without it, I think I would have found it hard with some kind of like this, a shared business model to participate in a project like this.
Yeah, that's great. Definitely sounds like you had a wonderful team and everybody was invested with their energy and their time and effort to really make the Dal House a big success.
Yeah, everybody was working on their strength. Like we had a great George, our friend, was a great like publicity person. It was all on social media mostly, but she did such a great job. And then they made stickers, and so everybody was like doing what they do best, and it all sort of the synergy of it all was phenomenal.
Yeah, for I'll have a link in the show notes again, but for anybody who hasn't seen it, Taimoor's like silhouette outline was actually the logo for the restaurant. It looks really cool. Like you're coming to his house to eat his homemade food, which I think was really good. Speaking of publicity, I want to talk about how the community in Colombia, what the reception was for the food. Reading the press, I remember someone saying, I know it's a South Asian restaurant and there's no butter chicken, but like you really have to come try this dal. You just have to like taste what this homemade South Asian food is like. So I'm curious what reception you got from the community in Colombia.
That there are several aspects to it, and all of them are wonderful. And I think that really gave us encouragement. One of the immediate response that we were seeing was one. I mean, it blew up. There was a 45-minute wait. And I think that was primarily because of the food. And as you said, there is no butter chicken. But again, I wanted to cook food that I think, and I've come to like, in a very stern way, like, okay, this is what like it should taste like. This is this particular dal. And that is the kind of dal that you will never find in a restaurant, or the bharta that you will never find in a restaurant, because those are home cooked meals, and most South Asian restaurants are, because of various dynamics of both in the US of immigration and also like the primary clientele being South Asian people, that they don't want to go and eat like, oh, this is ghar ka khana, this is home food, why should we eat it at the restaurant? So there is that division on one hand. On the other hand, of course, there's a certain, thanks to the homogenization of the market, there's a certain lowest common denominator food that you find in many places typically. So like, I mean, of course, there are great South Asian restaurants too. But this was this is the kind of food that you won't typically get at a restaurant, right? So it was more, as you said, like you're coming to someone's home. These are my mother's recipes, or my pupos, or my aunt's recipes. For the tea, I use one of my aunt's recipes, which she makes this amazing chai with like several spices, which knocks your flu out, but is also delicious and reminds us, it's kind of like, it's a very hoppy chai. So I just call it hoppy hazy chai because it is very hoppy and hazy. So I think that was something that people picked on and loved, because that's not something they have experienced. It is kind of like they came to my like family home and tasted recipes filtered through me that have come down through my mother's side or my father's side, and immediate, one of the things that happened was like people were coming back to the kitchen so much. Everybody wanted to come back and say thank you. And then there was this, I remember this South Asian uncle came, and he was slightly tipsy, and he's like, I want to salute you. So it was funny. But my most favorite, I think for all of us, was like, was this Gujarati young girl who came twice in 3 days. And she came and said that, my mother passed away 8 years ago, and I haven't had food like this since then. So thank you. And that's why I've come again, because this reminded me of my mother. And then the council, one of the city's councilwomen, she came, and she's from Lucknow originally. And she said, this is like Ammi's food. And I said, yes, this is Ammi's food. And so the people, like the food aspect, I think that, and then combined with what people really like just sitting together and talking to each other. In fact, we had like 3 floor seating tables with like capacity of 4 each, which were just like, makeshift tables. But even then, people preferred to sit on community tables than on those ones. And that's our friend Andrew, who was the host for most nights, was telling, along with some other people, was telling me. And in fact, there were even like random double dates. because people were happy to just share and have that kind. It's like, yeah, you come to a dinner party, you sit with people you don't know, you talk to them, you have food. I think that helped a lot. And people also, yeah, so people really enjoyed. I mean, there was halwa, which is like basically suji ka halwa, which all of you have had. Like, that's the main langar item. You get at temples, at shrines, at wherever. And again, very simple, but and something that you wouldn't typically find at a South Asian restaurant because it's considered so ordinary. And here people loved it. I described it as like a creamier, sweeter version of grits, just much finer in texture and fragrant with pappadanu's flower and cardamom and rose.
Yeah, I mean that just hearing you talk about the Gujarati girl who hasn't had homemade food because her mother passed away, that's just so powerful. Or the uncle who came and saluted you. It's like that's the power of like homemade desi cuisine. It just transports you back to your childhood and all those comforting memories. And I'm so glad other people in Colombia got to try it, and the reception was like so good. I hope that Indian food, a big reason of why I'm doing this channel is for those people to maybe they didn't get the recipes from their mother, or they just miss homemade food. I hope that true authentic homemade South Asian food will be won't be so unusual in the US and Canada.
And I think one more thing that I should have mentioned, I think, is the context. Like, we are in South Carolina, so there was a reception of those, of course, which were few, but still considerable people who have like this Gujarati girl or this Desi uncle. But for a lot of people, they said that they haven't tasted anything like this before and that they love it. Or somebody, I mean, I was mentioning the halwa because somebody was like, I'm not a sweet tooth, but I inhaled this. Or, but also, a friend who invited her parents and who haven't been to a South Asian restaurant before. They she grew up in South Carolina. She's part of the team. She's from around here, and she invited her family. And she said that for them it was such a wonderful opening experience of this exposure to something in such an intimate way and with such delightful and nourishing food. And she said that they loved it, and it was a significant moment for her parents and her family to sort of come out. And she said that they wouldn't have if I weren't part of this, right? I invited them. So there were a lot of people for whom, and I think that's where the community building aspect comes in. How do you reach across people who you have not much shared culture with, right? And then those things become ossified boundaries in the cultural politics and identity politics that we, the water of which we all live in, right? So how do you reach beyond that? And I think that was one of the best parts about this reception also. And a lot of restaurant workers came, and it's funny now that with that newspaper and with those stickers, everybody recognizes me in public. But so I was at this bar where apparently I didn't know, but a lot of restaurant workers come there and somebody recognized me. They're like, "Oh, that was so cool. You should do that again. We need food like this." So even people who are in the food industry were very happy. So it had a lot of aspects, I think, that went in. All these aspects were in the formation of it and were transformed out this way.
Yeah, I mean, that's incredible. That's so good to hear. And food is such a big connector, and just sitting down with other people. I wanted to ask you one final question. What suggestions do you have for people who want to start making homemade South Asian food? It's very intimidating for a lot of people in North America because there are a lot of spices, a lot of different techniques that we're not used to in the West. So do you have any suggestions to help make that easier and get them started?
Yes, I think the first suggestion is a more metaphysical one, is don't be afraid, just jump in, because the fear is much worse than doing it. And that's how you will learn. And two, just trust your taste and nose and your instinct. And there's no like rules in a sense. I mean, there are certain rules if you want to stick to South Asian cuisine, but if you feel like mixing it with something that you know from another tradition, feel free to do it. And the third thing is keep it for South Asian food, to come back to your question, like keep it minimal. And I think that is a problem with a lot of South Asian cuisine recipes that you typically see circulating. I mean, there are foods that are very complex and take a lot of spices and are difficult to make, but, and there may be many of them, but a huge variety of wonderful South Asian cooking traditions exist. Um, and so then this dal and this aloo mash or other vegetable items are such simple ones. And depends on the region. So don't think that if it doesn't have too many spices, this is not South Asian. I mean, if you go to Northwest Pakistan, which is and you have like a lamb tikka, it's literally nothing but salt and fat, and that's it, right? And or if you go have like my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, she was from Rajasthan, from Ajmer Sharif, and she had this. Her style of food was very minimal. She would make, for example, this fenugreek aloo methi, like fenugreek leaves with potatoes, and there was just literally nothing in it except salt and garlic and red chili flakes. That's it, right? And it's one of the most delicious things you can eat. So being minimal and not being afraid are two things that will take you a long way. And also not worrying about, oh, am I being authentic or not, but also looking for minimal things, and then slowly you can build on that.
Absolutely great advice. Thanks so much for joining me, Taimoor, and thanks for sharing this story with the listeners of the Cook Like an Auntie podcast.
Thank you for having me, and it was a joy talking about these things.
Thanks for listening to the Indian Food Explained podcast by Cook Like an Auntie. Please subscribe to this podcast and visit cooklikeanauntie.com to find recipes and videos related to this episode. You don't have to be an auntie to make delicious Indian food. Thanks for listening and see you next time.